Hello, everyone, and welcome to your first online lecture. In this first unit, we're doing two things. First, we're exploring the factors that bring us into closer proximity to one another. And second, we'll be examining some of the theoretical foundations of this course. And what I would like to start off with is a discussion of the ultimate barrier to intercultural communication, structural oppression. And structural oppression is really this ultimate barrier to intercultural communication, intercultural praxis, because it really kind of, places us within a larger social structure, and that placement really kind of separates us from each other. And so what we're going to be doing in this lecture is exploring what structural oppression means. And before I move on to the next slide, however, I want to make a little disclaimer. Some of your online lectures, including this one, will pack a lot of information into them, so you might find that you don't always understand the concepts right away. Don't be intimidated if that happens. These are all concepts that we will come back to in class, and you can always email me or come to my office hours with any questions. So before we get into what structural oppression means, however, I think it's helpful to go through a quick review of what we've covered this week. We focused on Chapter 2 of your textbook, which focused on globalization, the web of forces that bring us into closer proximity to one another. We discussed how globalization has those three interrelated facets, and we learned about imperialism, the expansion of a more powerful country's capital, political structures, and cultural practices and goods across the world. And finally, we discussed how, although globalization puts us in closer proximity to one another, that connection is not equal. And in your unit assignment, you placed yourself in this larger context. You learned to apply your learning to the clothes that you wear. You put positioning and framing into practice. And you also learned that the further down the production chain you moved, the more invisible the workers became. And that invisibility contributed to a lot of the hardships the people who worked in the factory encountered. And those experiences, the harm caused to them, has a name: oppression. And oppression is the ultimate barrier to intercultural praxis. And in this lecture, we're going to define oppression, explain how oppression is structural, and end with how it is a barrier to intercultural praxis. So oppression has several different components to it. First and foremost, it's a system of social stratification. And social stratification includes the following: categorizing people by race, class, gender, sexuality, and other categories of difference, ranking those categories, and that ranking system awards certain privileges and advantages to a dominant group, and that dominant group is able to realize its interests at the expense of the subjugated group. And stratification is experienced within institutions. And I want to take a little time to explain what institutions are. A common misconception about any of the quote-unquote isms that exist in our society, such as racism, heterosexism, and classism, is that they are personally held beliefs. That is, many people think of these terms as personally held biases against a particular group. So, to use racism as an example, many people define racism as an individual person not liking a specific racial group because of personally held beliefs about that group. Racial biases are real, but they do not in themselves constitute racism. Personally held biases are what is called prejudice. Racism and prejudice are not interchangeable terms. Whereas prejudice is a personally held bias, racism is a system that occurs within our institutions. Institutions are one of the basic building blocks of structural oppression. And so to define institutions Institutions are organizations with social practices that are, one, regularly and continuously repeated. That is, they are common everyday occurrences in our daily lives. They have established patterns of behavior. They're sanctioned and maintained by social norms. They become collectively held. So it's not just that one person accepts them as a norm, but that everyone does. And they hold major significance in our social structure. So that is, they are deeply embedded in our social world and structure our daily lives. The world we live in is the way it is because they exist. And finally, they have a plurality of roles. And what that means is that there are many functions that different people serve within an institution. Everyone within it isn't the same. Another way to look at this is that institutions are the organizations that we have to navigate in order to live our lives. They are where we learn the rules of society, where the rules of society are created, and where they are enforced. For example, one institution that we all share is school. We all serve some function at Seattle Central College. There are social practices, things that we do here, that we don't necessarily do elsewhere. For example, when you are having a discussion in class, there's often a practice of raising your hand and waiting for the instructor to call on you before speaking. If you're hanging out with your friends and having a discussion, you likely don't organize that discussion by raising your hands with each other. And furthermore, those practices are patterns of behavior inside the classroom that are continuous and that are accepted norms, which are repeated every time you go to school. So for example, the way you speak to your instructor is likely quite different from how you speak to a classmate. And those differences are more or less accepted by everyone. And schools also hold major significance in our social structure. Many of the jobs that you might be interested in require a college degree. And finally, there are also a variety of roles within a school. Think about your decision to attend Seattle Central and all the different people you encountered in those first days. Maybe you had to visit the registration office or the cashier to pay your tuition. You had to ring up your books with the cashiers at the bookstore. You might have had an appointment with an advisor to work out your schedule. And of course, you interact with your instructors and fellow students. There are various different people with various different functions within a school, and all of those roles help form a school as an institution. And school is just one example of an institution. What makes an institution is the organization of social practices according to the criteria in the last slide. And those social practices fall under 6 major categories. So you can think of it as kind of like 6 different types of institutions. The first is economic. And these are the institutions that produce and distribute goods and resources. So think of the places in which you buy and sell things and where those things are made. All of these are economic institutions. This also includes institutions involved in the production and distribution of currency. So a bank is an institution that would fall under this category. The second is political. And these are the institutions that regulate the use of and access to power. Political institutions also deal with the control of the use of force within a society and the rules and regulations that people must follow. So think of institutions where laws are made and where laws and agendas are enforced. The third is family and kinship. And this deals with the regulation of procreative and biological relationships between individuals. And this third type of institution often confuses students at first because family is seen as something private. But if you think about it, families do have a particular social organization to which you can apply the characteristics in the previous slide. So you can think of like the following questions as an example. Like, are there culturally held beliefs about a quote-unquote normal family? And do families hold major significance in our social structure? The fourth is education. where the young are socialized into adulthood. School isn't just where we learn our ABCs or calculus. It was where we learned the social rules of society. In the college setting, for example, you're not just learning about different academic fields. You're learning about what it means to be a professional and are being socialized into specific social practices of professionalism that you will need outside the classroom. The fifth is cultural, and this is where religious, scientific, and artistic artifacts are created, conserved, and differentially distributed. For these types of institutions, think about the places where you learn about art, recreation, science, and knowledge, and what is considered quote-unquote legitimate. There are many forms of art in the world, for example, but not all art is given the same level of value. Graffiti is as much a form of art as a painting by Da Vinci, but whereas the Mona Lisa sits in the Louvre as a form of high art in Paris, graffiti is criminalized as a way to create fear of poor people of color. So the cultural realm is not just where these artifacts themselves are produced, but where the meanings surrounding them are produced, and where the meanings surrounding the people who produce them are also produced. And the final sphere is stratification, where the distribution of positions, rewards, and resources are determined and regulated. And again, stratification is essentially the formation of groups and then ranking those groups hierarchically. In this category forms social relationships that group people into different categories, assign differing levels of value to those groups, and thus award privileges to some at the expense of others. We talk about stratification last because it permeates through the other five. Every example of inequality you can think of, such as racism, classism, or homophobia within each of those other categories, involves stratification. And one last thing I want to note is that these different types of institutions are not isolated from each other. They interact with one another, overlap, they link, and that's something that we're going to explore throughout the rest of this unit. So now that we've gone over institutions, I want you to complete exercise 2.1 before moving on to the next online lecture.